always said that I'm not a saint, that I am a work in progress, but I will not be held hostage by my past.
In an edited video posted on her YouTube channel, Naomi Campbell is responding to backlash about her connection to a slew of people who have questionable or even criminal pasts.
In the 5-minute video, Campbell responds to questions asked by someone off camera and defends herself against accusations made by the Daily Mail, which questions whether Campbell deserves an upcoming humanitarian award because of her connection to Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and Jeffrey Epstein, who recently was found hanged in his New York jail cell while awaiting trial for charges of sex trafficking and conspiracy, to which he pleaded not guilty.
A photo recently surfaced that shows one of Epstein's alleged teenage victims at Campbell's 31st birthday party aboard a yacht. That was in 2001. Campbell says the party was thrown for her by ex-boyfriend Flavio Briatore, who she says introduced her to Epstein. You can see Flavio in the photo here, as well as the alleged victim, who's thought to be there in
Jeffrey
the pink
Epstein
shirt.
may be dead,
Another
but this
photo of
story
Campbell
isn't.
aboard
A
the yacht.
shocking new report from the New York Times sheds light on the connection between Microsoft founder Bill Gates and the late Jeffrey Epstein. After Gates' name came up in connection with Epstein and MIT Media Lab, Gates gave a statement to the Wall Street Journal where he insisted he did not have any business relationship or friendship with Epstein. But new reporting from the New York Times outlines numerous meetings between Gates and Epstein and a conversation with Bill and Melinda Gates' foundation, a connection between their foundation and J.P. Morgan to set up a charitable fund that would financially benefit Epstein.
Questions are swirling around the state of Bill and Melinda Gates' marriage, leading up to last week's divorce announcement. The Wall Street Journal reporting Melinda began talking to divorce attorneys roughly 2 years before the filing. The paper citing people familiar with the matter and documents it reviewed. NBC has not yet independently seen or verified those documents. Last week, the multi-billionaires announced in a joint statement they were ending their 25-year marriage because we no longer believe we can grow together as a couple in this next phase of our lives. The Journal citing several people reporting that one source of concern for Melinda, a global advocate for women and girls, was Bill's dealings with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
You knew Jeffrey Epstein, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. We flew Bill Clinton and a lot of different that was a humanitarian trip to Africa. And
Yeah.
I met him on that trip because it was his plane. I didn't know who plane we was getting on, but it was a whole bunch of dignitary people who was with a delegation. And yeah, I met him, and you don't know people, what they do in their private lives. So yeah.
But tell me this, Chris. You was on this private plane, and you could tell that it was a private plane because they called it, Lolita Express?
Oh yeah, it was a private
Backlash
plane.
this morning.
Yes. Oh,
Prince
yes.
Andrew speaking publicly for the first time about his relationship with now deceased multimillionaire and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
Do I regret the fact that he has quite obviously conducted himself in a manner unbecoming? Yes.
Unbecoming. He was a sex offender.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being polite in the sense that he was a sex offender. But no. Was I right in having him as a friend at the time? And bearing in mind this was some years before he was accused of being a sex offender. I don't think there was anything wrong then.
Prince Andrew, Queen Elizabeth's second son and eighth in line to the British throne, telling BBC's Newsnight he has no regrets about his friendship with the businessman.
Now, still not. The reason being is that the people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn, either by him or because of him, were actually very useful.
When we take a deep breath, it's the ocean that produces more than half of that.
What astonished me was how many individuals were involved in assisting with this abuse, whether they participated in it or just allowed it to occur by helping enable it. So I call that the army of abusers, because I really see that not only did they assist with it, but then they assisted later to keep these girls quiet.
And there's an allegation that I just read that you did not pursue a federal indictment, even though your staff had advocated that you do so. Is that accurate?
That is not accurate.
You find in this particular case some of the best people and some of the worst. And Police Chief Ryder and Detective Ricari both did such an amazing job. And I think that that kind of gets lost in the fact that the case went away in the way that it did.
So I'm hopeful that in this new era where we have more comfort in people coming forward, victims coming forward and saying that happened to me too, that we will be able to make more movement in the area against the people who were involved in this.
I was 16.
I was 16.
I started going to him when I was like 14 turning 15.
If you think at 14, $200, that's a lot of money at 14 years old. I mean, that's a lot of money now.
She's like, oh, do you need to make any extra money? I'm like, yeah. She's like, okay, I can give you, like $200. It's this older guy in Palm Beach. He gets a lot of massages from girls. That was really.
They were recruited by someone who was adept at finding girls that would be willing to, go to a house for a few $100s. And as it started out, give a man a back rub, but many cases it turned into something far worse than that, elevated to a crime, and a serious crime, in some cases sexual batteries.
My life would have been different if I would have never went to Jeffrey Epstein's house. It was just a dark turning point in my life.
On June 30th, 2008, Jeffrey Epstein, a Palm Beach multimillionaire hedge fund manager, received what might have been the most lenient plea deal for a serial sex offender in U.S. history. The Miami Herald identified over 60 of his victims, just young middle and high school girls at the time of the abuse. More than a decade later, several of them are talking for the first time about how they were molested by Epstein and believe they were betrayed by the very prosecutors who were supposed to hold Epstein accountable.
They came from fairly disadvantaged backgrounds. There was some dysfunction in their families. The lure of a lot of money was more than they were able to resist.
I went from an abusive situation to being a runaway to living in foster homes to just already being hardened by life on the streets. The other girls that I personally know of that were coming from trailer parks, that were having gun shootings, drugs.
My mother was on drugs at the time, and she couldn't provide for me, and I was pretty much homeless.
One child would be lured over, would be paid substantial sums of money, would be offered the further inducement of being paid a bounty for anybody else that she was able to bring to Epstein. A network developed where many young girls in the same kinds of circumstance wound up being victimized.
The three of us slid into the backseat of the cab and we drove, and I remember just driving down Okeechobee Boulevard and thinking how I had never been on Palm Beach Island before in my whole entire life, that I had lived in West Palm Beach.
By the time I was 16, I brought him up to 75 girls, all the ages of 14, 15, 16, people going from 8th grade to 9th grade at just school parties is where I would recruit them from.
All Jeffrey cared about was go find me more girls. His appetite was insatiable. He couldn't stop. He wanted new, fresh, young faces every single day.
The sheer volume of girls, the frequency, sometimes several or many in the same day, the age of the girls. In some cases, there were victims that didn't know each other, had never met each other, but they had basically the same story.
I remember there was a staircase, and it was like kind of like a spiral almost.
And she brings us up the stairs, and it was like spiral stairs.
You walked into his bedroom, around his bed, to almost like a very little hall, and then it was another door. And that's where everything would happen, was in his bathroom. He would have a dresser, and it was filled with like, the first drawer was lotion, and then like the third drawer down was like sex toys. So we would take the massage table out and set it up in the middle of the room.
And then he came in with his white towel on around him.
And then he just laid down in his towel on his stomach, and he was just talking to people on the phone. When he flipped over, that's when he said, okay, you can go ahead and take off your shirt and pants, but you can stay in your underwear.
He would want us to stand next to him, and he would masturbate while he stared at us, touched us.
To pull his nipples and to play with them in between his fingers, and also while I was playing with his nipples, he kept doing that stuff to me. But he was very aggressive, like when he would do it.
And then he tried to put his finger in my underwear, and I like jumped back, and I pulled back, and I was like, whoa. And he's like, no, it's okay, I'm sorry, I won't do that. And then he went back to doing that. He's like, just on the outside, and I'm like, oh my God.
It ended with sexual abuse and intercourse, and then a pat on the back. You've done a really good job. Like, thank you very much, and here's $200. Before you know it, I'm being lent out to politicians and to academics and to people royalty and people that you would never think, like, how did you get into that position of power in the first place if you're this disgusting, evil, decrepit person on the inside?
Epstein, then in his 50s, was also suspected of organizing sex activities with underage girls at his homes in New York City, New Mexico, and on his private island in the Caribbean.
You're talking about hundreds of children all over the world.
Victims that were alleged sex slaves of Jeffrey Epstein, that they brought over from Eastern Bloc countries.
I've seen hundreds and hundreds of girls go through Jeffrey's swinging door, his ever-revolving door.
This guy is big time. He knows people that know people that know people.
Flight logs from his plane and his address book read like a who's who of some of the richest and most famous and powerful people in the world. Celebrities, actors, philanthropists, academics, and world leaders.
It's really disappointing to look, as a lawyer, to look at this circumstance and say, how did this happen? One individual commits one abuse of a minor, in one instance of abuse of a minor, and they're held accountable for years and years through the criminal justice system. This individual abused hundreds of girls, and nothing happened. It's really, really unfortunate. We look at that and we say, how did the criminal justice system fail these girls in such a significant way? How has that happened?
There was ample physical evidence and witness testimony to support the girls' stories, including notepads seized from Epstein's home with their names and phone numbers, along with phone records. Despite the corroborating evidence, Palm Beach State Attorney Barry Krischer wanted to charge Epstein only with a misdemeanor.
And once that happened, it was clear to me that justice would not be served by the state attorney in the handling of the case, and we referred it to the FBI. And then there were many, many more victims after that time.
Epstein hired somebody that would impress the state attorney, Barry Krischer, to drop the investigation.
The U.S. Attorney's Office got involved with this case with Jeffrey Epstein's A-list of defense attorneys that are extremely well known and extremely powerful. I think these attorneys were able to manipulate the sitting U.S. attorney and the assistant U.S. attorney working the cases. A few things happened in this case that during my law enforcement career I've never seen before. The U.S. attorneys here had an indictment and they were sending it back and forth to Jeffrey's lawyers for changes. Never seen anything like that before.
Well, I started getting somewhat of an inclination that this is a situation where somehow, for some reason, the defendant and the government are working together against the victims, although that kind of conspiracy theory sounds so preposterous that I didn't want to believe it.
A subsequent FBI investigation found a sprawling network of victims and enough evidence to fill a 53-page indictment with federal sex crime charges. But Miami U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta signed off on a secret plea bargain, while deliberately not informing Epstein's victims. The deal granted Epstein and his accomplices immunity from federal prosecution. Epstein pleaded guilty in state court to 2 prostitution charges and served 13 months. Epstein's punishment was like that of no other sex offender in Florida. He had a private space in a vacant wing of the Palm Beach County stockade, but records show he spent limited time there. He was allowed to go to his private West Palm Beach office, where he spent up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, often accepting visitors, including female friends.
What he ended up pleading to was a joke. The sentence he served was even a bigger joke. And then his probation was a slap in everybody's face.
The government, by that agreement, was definitely putting their name on something that they believed at that moment was ending the possibility of prosecution and ending the victim's rights. Right there, that's what the government believed.
How can you do that to all these girls? How can you tell them that what he did was okay?
Acosta, now President Trump's labor secretary, didn't explain why he sealed the details of Epstein's plea so that no one would know the scope of Epstein's crimes or who was involved. Years later, he said he and his staff were bombarded by Epstein's army of legal superstars, who launched a year-long assault against him and other prosecutors that they took all the way to the U.S. Attorney General in Washington, D.C.
If you don't let the victims be a part of the solution, there is no solution. And in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, the prosecutors created a universe that excluded the victims and disempowered them for a second time and empowered the perpetrator. That is absolutely unacceptable.
Really, if you think about it too hard, it's scary because this is our government that's supposed to protect us, but has done everything to protect, a pedophile.
Federal prosecutors claim they achieved a victory by forcing Epstein to register as a sex offender, but there's no agency that regularly monitors his whereabouts. He lists his residence as the U.S. Virgin Islands, but his flight records show that he takes trips around the United States and Europe in his new private plane.
This is probably the most unjust outcome of any case that I've been involved in 40 years.
I think it's something that the government just can't ignore anymore. There's so many of us that they just can't forget about it. It's not something that's going to be yesterday's news.
Since then, about 24 civil lawsuits have been filed in connection with the case, including one set to go to trial in December in state court in Palm Beach County that could finally expose more about Epstein's crimes, how many people were involved, and why his case was dismissed by federal prosecutors. Another case filed by Epstein's victims in federal court seeks to invalidate Epstein's plea deal and send him to prison.
I am involved in this case in defending the integrity of the justice system, in making sure that we do everything we can to be sure that justice is not bought.
He needs to be behind bars. He needs to be behind bars for the rest of his life. There is way too many girls for him not to be. It's just mind-blowing.
Look at the secluded island where the late Jeffrey Epstein is accused of trafficking underage girls.
We're also hearing a first-hand account from one of those alleged victims. Little St. James off the coast of St. Thomas was privately owned by Epstein until his death in August, and you can only get to this island by helicopter or private boat. The seclusion appears to have been by design, making it hard for government officials to monitor Epstein's behavior and, according to prosecutors, even harder for the young girls to escape.
Little St. James may look like a tropical getaway, but authorities say Jeffrey Epstein used the private island to hide his criminal activity.
So he felt that he can basically be protected, or
he could get away with things.
He can get away with it.
Denise George became Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands just months before Epstein's death by suicide last year. Her office is now suing Epstein's estate.
Why pursue these sort of charges now?
Well, all I'll have to say is why not now? I cannot speak for what happened in the past at all. What I do know is that because of Epstein's wealth and power, he was able to conceal a lot of this.
Epstein acquired Little St. James in 1998 and nearby Great St. James 18 years later. The lawsuit seeks to confiscate Epstein's property, including the islands, valued at $86 million. The convicted pedophile registered as a sex offender in the Virgin Islands in 2010 after serving time in Florida for procuring an underage girl for prostitution. But George says monitoring Epstein on his island came with unique challenges for authorities checking up on him.
They were stopped at the dock and they were told that, no, this is as far as you can go because this is my private property and I will not allow you to go in any further.
Court documents allege Epstein flew into Cyril E. King Airport, the only airport on St. Thomas, and the same one we flew into earlier this week.
The area that the private jets fly in is separate and apart from where all
the
commercial flights. And that also helps with the concealment.
From there, Epstein allegedly shuttled underage girls to the island using 2 helicopters. According to the complaint, air traffic controllers and other airport personnel reported seeing Epstein with girls who appeared to be as young as 11. The Attorney General tells us Epstein controlled all communication and transportation on Little St. James, and that his alleged victims were essentially trapped.
Remember, he owns a whole island, so it wasn't a situation where a child or a young woman would be able to just break away and run down the street to the nearest police station.
Now, Epstein's island here is about 2 miles from St. Thomas. According to the lawsuit, one of his 15-year-old alleged victims was so desperate to escape, she actually tried to swim away.
Another of Epstein's alleged victims, who spoke to CBS News on the condition that we conceal her face and voice, tells us what she said happened to her.
He raped me. He brought me off the island, actually to his office in St. Thomas, and he actually raped me in his office. He also trapped me in his room on the island, where he had a gun strapped to the bedpost. I couldn't leave.
I sat down with one woman who says she was hired to massage Jeffrey Epstein as a teenager, but she says it turned into much more.
I felt disgusting. I wanted to go take a shower. I felt violated.
This woman says Jeffrey Epstein ruined her life.
He's done something really bad in my mind mentally where I now have to seek help.
She asks that we disguise her voice and not show her face. In a $50 million lawsuit, she's known as Jane Doe No. 5. After years of silence, she's talking about the day she says Jeffrey Epstein paid her for a sensual massage. Jane says she was just a sophomore in high school, just 15 or 16 years old, when someone at her school told her how she could make some quick cash.
If you go to this guy's house for $200 and give him a massage for $200, basically it's an in and out thing. It's a massage, nothing bad about it.
Jane says she and a girl her age took a taxi to Epstein's house on Palm Beach. Jane says an assistant paid the driver and took them into an upstairs room. It had a massage table and a shower. And that's when Jane says Epstein walked in, completely naked.
He jumped in the shower and told me to remove my clothes down to my bra and my panties. We both were looking at each other like, what are we going to do now?
Jane says they were scared and they did as they were told. After the shower, Jane says Epstein wrapped himself in a towel stretched across the massage table face down. And Jane says she massaged his legs and her friend massaged his back.
He flipped over and his towel was gone and my heart sank. I got really disturbed and nervous. He basically was, touching himself and touching my friend and trying to touch me. He also had, sex toys stored away.
There were sex toys there?
Yes.
Did he take some of them out?
Yes.
The entire time, Jane says Epstein talked sexually and repeated the same phrase over and over.
Just let it go. Just let it go. Just let it happen.
After the alleged massage, Jane says she and her friend were paid $200 each, then put into a taxi and sent away. She says for months, Epstein's assistant tried to get her to come back and service Epstein again, but she says she would either refuse or just ignore the call.
BNN.